This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I didn't like the idea of a 2-week gap. So delighted that the court system didn't require my presence today. Today, we're talking about Renaissance marriage. It was a very hard narrowing down I had to do. Let's see if I was more successful this time than all my other times, that I never seem to have enough time. But I find these images fascinating, and I learned so much about the world of the Renaissance. What I love best is humans. We're the same. We say terrible things, we do wonderful things, we do terrible things. And just because people lived in the 15th and 16th century, they're not so different than we are. So let's see how they viewed Renaissance marriage, or how they viewed marriage during the Renaissance. I'm going to begin with 2 quotes. No, I'm not a vicious feminist, but I find it fascinating that writers from the 16th century, in this case, Moderata Fonte, who was a very well-known, famous Venetian writer and poet, had some interesting things to say about marriage. What exactly does a woman gain from it, except that instead of being her own mistress and the mistress of her own money, she becomes a slave and loses her liberty and her control over her own property? Interesting. I think some women might say that now, and others would violently disagree. Or Mario Equicola, book on the nature of love. Whoever loves permanently must love the body as well as the soul, because the nature of love requires that not only the lover's souls be loved, but that the senses too be satisfied in their natural need for sensual pleasure. So in this period, in this 15th and particularly in the 16th century, there was a growing awareness of the need of sensuality, of physical love in the world of marriage. Not just for procreation, but since that was the requirement of the church, that you could not prevent procreation, then this was in order to encourage procreation. And we're going to come back to this wonderful Lotto marriage portrait almost at the end of today's lecture. And of course, that's Cupid yoking the couple. And Lorenzo Lotto is one of the strangest and most interesting painters, so we'll come back to him at the end. All right, we all know that weddings have always been the occasion for flamboyant spending, and I had a lot of fun. What was I going to show you? So I picked a British one, and I picked something that was truly over the top. I have no idea where it is, but it was an interesting Google experience looking up extravagant weddings. Now, of course, in the Renaissance, particularly, not so different than royal marriages of today, it was a dynastic alliance. So marriages were extremely important. We saw that with Catherine de' Medici. We saw that with Marie de' Medici. It was a way of connecting power to power, gaining access to ports, gaining access to financial stability. So enormously important. But what I want to remind you is that before the Council of Trent edicts in 1563, when the Council of Trent opened, you did not need to get married in church. Only mutual consent was required. And thus, since there wasn't kind of a legal reality or kind of a physical, visual bonding, instead of the marriage ceremony, what evolved were extensive rituals and public manifestations. So parades, feasts, grand entrances, transporting of the wife's possessions from her house, her parents' house, to the husband's house. So you had to make it visual. And of course, I'm talking about wealthy or upper class or wealthy merchant families. So the exchange of gifts, the processions like we see with the British. I'm going to show you some feasts. I think the one on the right was going to be a feast. And also, as we saw with Catherine de' Medici, ballet and other kinds of plays and other kinds of performances. So let's begin with a few domestic objects that visualize the performances and the celebrations of the Renaissance, because one of the objects that was a part of the marriage ceremony and exchange of gifts were called cassone, or trunks, and they were often decorated. And in these cassone would be transported the dowry, the trousseau, and they would be carried from the gifts would be given by the husband and then transported back to the husband's family house. So I'm showing you two initially. This one by Apollonio di Giovanni, which represents the meeting of Solomon and Sheba, where the journey of the Queen of Sheba to Israel was to witness the wisdom of King Solomon. And she was accompanied by a large entourage, which you see moving from left to right. You have the procession, the entry, and then the meeting. Now notice that this scene, or this multiple scenes, take place in what is clearly a Renaissance city. And if you look closely, like the figure in the center with the red turbaned hat, that was the kind of hat that the Medici wore, Cosimo de' Medici wore in Renaissance Florence. So what we're having here, we have this exotic Old Testament scene that is brought to life in in a Florentine city, possibly or probably Florence. There's also a legend that the Queen of Sheba refused to cross the bridge because it was built from the wood from the true cross. So here we have a moral for the bride. Brides ought to tread with similar caution and care. And I urge you, when you go to museums, to seek out these cassone trunks or the panels that decorated cassone, because I had to eliminate many of them because they have very complicated stories. But I want you to think about why a given subject was chosen. Here, clearly to display wealth, display ceremonies and processions that emulated contemporary ones. And just another detail that I find fascinating. So here we have Sheba coming to Israel, but look at all the winged cupids on a top above the pilasters and columns in the loggia where the meeting takes place. Not things you would find in the Old Testament, but again, referencing plays and performances and poetry and toasts made during a Renaissance wedding. There are the red tights, the multiple colored tights, all these things are evocative of contemporary customs and costumes. Another one by Marco del Buono Giamberti, the story of Esther. Again, an Old Testament scene, but placed even more clearly in contemporary Florence, with the rusticated palazzo, very much like the Medici Palace on the left, the church with the domed choir, similar to the San Lorenzo, which had no facade, and the loggia in which the feast takes place, very much like the Rucellai loggia in Florence, where literally the Rucellai wedding feast took place. So Esther comes to Shushan to compete with other virgins for the attention and future marriage to King Ahasuerus. And in preparation, those virgins had to undergo rituals of purification. And when King Ahasuerus sees Esther, he decides that she must be his queen because of her beauty and her virtue. And he holds a great feast, which we see on the right side. And the procession, even more clearly here, evokes similar processions around the ceremony called the anellamento, the ring ceremony, which would take place in the bride's home. And then they would process, both families would process to a loggia or a location for the festive meal. And in fact, this visualization, the procession through the city, was a way of legitimizing the marriage because it was visible to the city. So it was almost as if we don't need a marriage in a church, but we need the city to legitimize a marital ceremony. Now, this one is slightly different. And with this cassone panel, we actually know for whose wedding it was painted. It's been attributed to Fra Angelico, but more likely a lesser painter, which I'd never heard of, Giovanni Toscanini. And on this cassone are depicted scenes from Boccaccio's The Nymph of Fiesole, Il Ninfale Fiesolano. And it was commissioned for the marriage of Cosimo de' Medici, the elder, to Contessina de' Bardi in 1416. But it's a little hard to decipher, so I have to read it from left to right. On the left, you see Diana seated like a Florentine matron with her nymphs before her, and she warns them absolutely not to flirt with men. Now, Africo, a young man, stumbles upon their enclave. He's in trouble. You know, Diana can be really vicious. And he falls in love with one of Diana's nymphs. And I'm assuming that it is the nymph in red depicted twice in the nymph entourage. So there's a nymph in red in the back on the left, and then there's a nymph, the same nymph in red holding a stick looking back as if she's tempted to pursue Africo. So Africo falls in love with Mensola and then takes a nap, falls asleep, and has a vision of Venus encircled in resplendent light. There you see in the center to the right of sleeping Africo, Venus. Venus persuades him to dress as a woman, to deceive Mensola and ravish her. And so again, remembering the realities of Renaissance marriage, where a young girl, often around the age of 14, is married off to an older guy whom she has never met and is expected immediately to consummate the marriage, which I would imagine would feel a little rapish. So here we see Venus telling Africo to dress as a woman, and we move a little bit farther to the right. We see Africo standing with a spear. And then in the far right, we see Africo and Mensola without their clothes on. And I guess he has come upon the nymphs bathing, and he's about to ravish Mensola. Other panels, which I'm not going to show you, we see the submission of Mensola, but then Africo claims, oh no, he was the victim. Venus compelled him to do it. It wasn't his fault. Have we heard this before in trials? And then following consummation, Mensola leaves, she runs away, and she is pregnant. Africo, after a month without his beloved Mensola, is so distraught that he commits suicide and Diana turns him into a stream. Mensola gives birth to a boy. Diana discovers this. She's vicious to any of her virginal nymphs who dally with men. And she discovers Mensola and the child and turns Mensola into a stream. The streams of Africo and Mensolo join together under a bridge east of Florence in Settignano. The child is saved, raised, and becomes a governor over the land and produces a large clan. This is the origin myth of Fiesole and Florence, which of course honors the origins of the Medici family, who came from the Mugello, who took over the governing of Florence and produced a large clan. So all of this arcane story from Boccaccio has a moral and justifies the marriage, or celebrates the marriage, and justifies the Medici's claim to Florence. Fascinating. And that the whole issue of forced sexual relations is totally downplayed in this image. It's the sleeping, somewhat innocent Africa and Venus who are the central figures of the scene. And then if you look at the border around it, it's rather phallic. Birds and roses, but the birds look like penises. And I'm not so sure that the roses look like female genitalia, but there is definitely a phallic sense to this border decoration, particularly if you look on the sides with the erect birds, can we say? And from Boccaccio, he says, as they struggled thus, something awoke that till that time had slept dejectedly. Lifting its haughty crest, it commenced wildly to knock against the gate and thrust its head so far within it that it gained entry, though not without great struggle and loud shrieks, and not without perhaps the loss of some blood. So pretty graphic. So we have, I think, many times whitewashed or cleansed Renaissance sexuality. And this one scene that I'm showing you, shows really the transition from the faithful virgin to the active bride or sexually active bride of Venus. So really interesting. We're seeing how these stories and myths are specifically chosen to relate to the experience of Renaissance marriage. Now I'm going to take you into another marriage where we actually have a book that is illustrated with the parade floats. I mean, these floats, I'm going to show you in a second, always make me think of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So this is the marriage of Costanza Sforza to Camilla d'Aragona. There were 5 days of celebrations. On May 26th in 1475, Camilla entered Pesaro, the city-state of Costanzo Sforza. The next day, on May 27th, there was a brief marriage ceremony in the Palazzo Ducale on the right, and an oration in the cathedral, followed by a 7-hour, 6-course banquet, a ballet performance, and extraordinary sugar sculptures. 2 days later, on May 29th, there was a joust and a procession led by the Triumph of Fame. And I'm going to show you the illustrations of this procession. This was an extremely important marriage. It was a strategic alliance between Costanzo and King Ferrante of Naples. Naples had a lot of importance to central Italian politics. King, huge army, and ports. And then in 1483, Costanzo died, not so long after his marriage, with having had no child with Camilla. Camilla then ruled Pesaro until Costanzo's illegitimate son, Giovanni, was of age in 1489. So I just wanted to give you that historical fact, because here we have an example of a woman ruling as regent. This was really one way for a woman to have power, as we saw with Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici. So here are some of the illustrations from the 1475 Le Nozze di Costanzo Sforza e Camilla d'Aragona a Pesaro nel Maggio, I can't possibly tell you 1475 in Italian. On the left, we see the float with the Triumph of Fame, with trumpeting cupids holding lilies. One wonders whether the lily is announcing that Camilla is indeed a virgin. And we have the coats of arms below. Then the next one is the Triumph of Love. There is winged Cupid with fiery flames below him, the passion of love, all the torches, which visualizes the consummation of this marriage. And then I unfortunately can't see who's on the upper right. And I just included this wonderful detail of the camel, probably with grains or possibly even money that would be thrown to the surrounding people. So the exotic nature of these processions and parades. And over on the left, we have an enthroned queen entering on atop an elephant. And I think justice, oh, no, the moon above, and the sign of Scorpio below, and Mercury below that with the health, he's the commerce and eloquence. So all these figures of gods and goddesses participated in these marriage ceremonies. Pandolfo Colanuccio gave the wedding oration, and I had to give you this excerpt. I'm amazed at how many men are hostile to marriage, since they believe that wives are an impediment to work, studies, and the contemplation of the truth. There can be no happiness without a wife, and no one should be judged wise, as Aristotle says, who spurns so great a good of nature, so great a pleasure of friendship, and the usefulness of so great a gift. God established marriage. Nature beckons us to use and enjoy it. People, I have all my typos, sorry, people agree upon it, and individual cities have founded rites and solemn ceremonies for it. So here I just wanted, this is one of the rare opportunities to see visually what these parades and ceremonies and triumphal processions looked like. Finally, here is the Greek god of marriage, Hymen, holding the torches of passion, and his outfit, his tunic, is decorated with diamond rings, and two wills, two hearts, two passions are bonded in marriage by a diamond. Now we're going to see diamonds again when we look at the Medici. This, of course, made me wonder, and I haven't had the opportunity to dig around whether there is a connection between the Pesaro Sforza and the Florentine Medici. My guess is there probably is, because of this diamond ring imagery, unless diamond rings were absolutely associated with marriage, as they are now. See, things don't change. And then all these cupids, this kind of fountain of fertility and love on the right. Okay, now this was one of my really exciting, I get a little nerdy, kind of maybe discoveries or connection making. So in 1487, Annibale Bentivoglio, the eldest son of Giovanni Bentivoglio, the ruler of Bologna, was married to Lucrezia d'Este, who was the natural daughter or the illegitimate daughter of Duke Ercole d'Este of Ferrara. They were betrothed many years before, in 1478, when they were 8 and 9 years old. So definitely a power dynastic alliance. In order to in order to celebrate this marriage, Giovanni Bentivoglio wanted to look like the richest, the most celebratory duke, and he needed to destroy houses and shops along the path of the triumphal procession. So it wasn't good enough just to take place in the existing piazza. They needed to, broaden the street and broaden the piazza to handle 3,000 guests. So enormous. And citizens and noblemen paid homage and honored Giovanni Bentivoglio with gifts. I loved this detail. The horses' hoofs in the procession were shod with silver. Bentivoglio wanted to be famous throughout Italy, throughout the land, as the most generous, richest ruler. And so here we see the Palazzo Comunale now, but the Bentivoglio Palace, which was destroyed in 1507. We'll get to that in a minute. There we see Annibale. There we see a rather sad portrait of Lucrezia. And Giovanni Bentivoglio is on the rearing horse at his tomb on the left. Okay, so why am I showing you these Botticelli? Well, when the Virgin adoring the sleeping Christ child was exhibited at the Frick in New York, it was Treasures from Edinburgh, as I remember, I noted that this painting was painted on canvas. Botticelli typically painted on wood panels. And that made me think, Botticelli's Birth of Venus is also painted on canvas. So I dug a little bit around and discovered that Lorenzo de' Medici attended the Bentivoglio wedding. And I thought to myself, what if these were his wedding present to Annibale? On canvas, it means they can be rolled up and transported easily. And we know, even though for years it was assumed that the Birth of Venus was the partner to the Primavera, we'll get there in a minute, we now know that they ended up in the same Medici villa, but they were not commissioned for the same occasion. So that got me to thinking. I thought a lot about, as we will discover, the Primavera and the paintings that were commissioned with the Primavera, all on wood, and that here we have two Venus and Virgin Mary images painted on canvas. So this Virgin Mary adoring the sleeping Christ child is the kind of image that was considered appropriate and almost necessary to decorate a bridal chamber. And I show you an example from Carpaccio's St. Ursula cycle, where Ursula is talking to her father, the king, and above her bed, you see an image of the Virgin and Child. And on the left, you see a typical portable altar or tabernacle that would be in a marriage chamber to encourage the birth of beautiful children, to advise, to be a model of virtue for the wife. So thinking about Botticelli's Virgin adoring the sleeping Christ child, you have the roses of Venus and the symbol also of the Virgin, and in the lower right corner, strawberries, or evocative of the future blood of Christ. And of course, the sleeping Christ child also evokes the dead Christ. And if you notice, his hand is where Christ will be ultimately wounded. And there the Virgin kneels above him as a role model for, it would be for Lucrezia. So if we look at the Botticelli, what we'll see again with the Primavera is Botticelli circulated in the Medici court with authors such as Ficino and Poliziano, and where he might not have been humanistically educated, he was in that environment and surrounded by this kind of celebration of antiquity, this flourishing of contemporary poetry, and was able in both of these extraordinary works, his Birth of Venus and the Primavera, to take all these literary sources and fuse them into his own very new, unique classical work. So I'm just going to share some of the sources, the literary sources for Botticelli's incredible image, the celebration of Venus as a goddess of love and beauty. And so let's look at Poliziano's from his Stanze per la Giostra. And born with the white foam in rare and joyous acts, a maiden with a heavenly race by playful zephyrs is pushed to the shore. She travels on a seashell, and it seems that the heavens rejoice. You might swear that the goddess came out of the waves, pressing her hair with her right hand and covering the sweet fruit with another. Of course, we can all see that Venus could not possibly stand on that shell. It's going to tip over. She doesn't have any water on her. She has been miraculously dried by the warm wind as she is welcomed ashore. And from Homer in his To Aphrodite, of august gold wreathed and beautiful Aphrodite I shall sing, to whose domain belong the battlements of all sea-laved cypress, where, blown by the moist breath of Zephyrus, she was carried over the waves of the resounding sea in soft foam. The gold-filleted Horai happily welcomed her and clothed her with heavenly raiment. So the arrival of Venus parallels the arrival of the bride. And Macrobius, another Roman author, explains that upon Venus's birth, the capacity for engendering living things in an unbroken sequence of reproduction was transferred from the water to Venus, so that all things would thenceforth come into being through the intercourse of male and female. And Boccaccio tells us that Venus was born from the severed testicles, and that the movement of waves and sea foam are all things needed to generate a child. And Hildegard of Bingen, who we met, I think, in our first class, intercourse begins with desire, brought about by a virile wind that stirs up the male's blood into foamy semen and erects his phallus for ejaculation. So if we recall that the purpose of marriage was to have offspring, this is the perfect image to hang in the bridal chamber. And finally, Ficino, part of the Medici court, friends with Botticelli, Venus is the natural and procreative force and spirit, as well as whatever increases the latter. Very good for a healthy and prosperous life, since she makes a man fruitful and happy. And of course, Botticelli's Venus was inspired by a Hellenistic Venus in the Medici collection, the Venus Pudica, or now known as the Medici Venus that you see in the lower right. And other scholars have commented on this intertwined bodies of Zephyrus and Flora as evocative of intercourse and sexual union. And finally, just to be a little rowdy, I'm going to read to you the wedding poem by Giovanni Pontano for his own daughter, not this marriage. Lascivious Venus advises girls to sleep without clothes and to deny no pleasures to their insistent husbands. Lascivious Hymen tells wives to sleep without clothes and to excite their ardent husbands to the games of love. From Venus comes everything that the husband enjoys, everything the bride enjoys among delights and joys. Hymen invents every tenderness, every sweetness, every game, and two breaths come together in one. The pleasures of the marriage bed are openly embraced. So we have to stop cleansing the Renaissance marriage bed and understand that the depiction of nude women, alias Venuses, were there to assist in the procreation of heirs, of offspring. And just to underscore this, Botticelli's Venus is extraordinary in that she's almost life-size. She stands there in this extraordinary large painting, but she echoes imagery that you would find on marriage chests, like the cassone in the upper right, or the reclining Venus with Cupid and a chain of roses. And I just want to comment that it wasn't only the female that was nude, because both the cassone above and the panel that I show you below are images of male nudes. So often these cassone were paired, and you can imagine that when you'd lift the lid, one inner lid would be the nude male, and the other inner lid would be the nude female, often shown as Venus. Okay, we're going to do the Primavera pretty quickly because I've done it before, but it's also one of my favorites. I couldn't resist. So the reason for years scholars thought that the Primavera and the Birth of Venus were painted as pairs was because Vasari saw them at the Villa di Castello in 1550. However, that is not where they were originally. Now, we know how the Primavera ended up at the Medici Villa di Castello, because the Primavera was painted for Giovanni di Pier Francesco, or no, excuse me, for the marriage of Lorenzo di Pier Francesco. He and his brother Giovanni bought the Villa di Castello. So we know how that got there. How did Botticelli's Birth of Venus get to the Castello villa? Well, the Bentivoglio were expelled from Bologna in 1506, just when Giovanni de' Medici, the future Leo X, was about to be appointed papal legate to Bologna. So he was around, and we know the Medici knew the Bentivoglio because his father Lorenzo attended Annibale's marriage. So when they were expelled, the Bentivoglio were expelled and their palace was destroyed, my guess is Giovanni de' Medici, who had exquisite taste in art, certainly as we know when he was Pope, left with the Birth of Venus and the Madonna adoring the sleeping Christ child and brought them to Florence. Don't know how the Virgin got to Edinburgh, but I imagine that is how the Venus got to the Villa of Castello. Okay, so we're going to try quickly to go through this very complicated image of Botticelli's Primavera. So the first thing, when you come upon a large painting like this, I want you to stop and think, does this painting make sense? Is this a story? Is it a unified group of figures? And I think you would agree that these figures are not unified. They're not really engaged with each other and telling us a story. So when something looks a little odd, you have to try and explain why. So we know that this was commissioned to celebrate the marriage of Lorenzo di Pier Francesco to Semirande da Piano, and who had originally been engaged to Giuliano de' Medici, brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was murdered in the Pazzi conspiracy in the Duomo on Easter in 1478. This branch of the Medici, the Pier de Francesco branch, lived next door to the Medici palace. And so this painting, along with two others, were not for the Medici palace that still stands, but for a now destroyed smaller palace for built for Pier Francesco de' Medici. So here is the complicated Medici family tree. So we have two branches. I can't see because there's things, but on the upper right is Cosimo the Elder, whose portrait is at that level on the left. And on the upper left is his brother Lorenzo. Going down from these two, the grandson of Cosimo the Elder is Lorenzo the Magnificent, whose portrait bust is on the right, and descending from Lorenzo, Cosimo il Vecchio's brother, you have Pier Francesco, the portrait of whom is that profile of the guy with the jowls, and his son Lorenzo and Lorenzo's brother Giovanni, who are depicted in the other portraits on that side. On the lower right is the Medici Palace, and to its right are the buildings owned by Pier Francesco. So we know that Giuliano de' Medici, younger brother of Lorenzo, was murdered in 1478, and the Pazzi conspiracy was instigated by none other than Sixtus IV. And the Medici were in deep trouble at this point. The banks were failing. Lorenzo the Magnificent had been too magnificent, had spent too much money He even plundered the inheritance of his wards, Lorenzo and Giovanni. He did pay them back in 1485. And so how do you get money? You have to negotiate and be an extraordinary diplomat and negotiate an advantageous marriage. Clearly, that marriage had already been in discussion because Giuliano was engaged to Semirande. And Semirande da Piano came from the town of Piombino. I show it to you there, which was on the coast. So it brought with it a port, and it brought the wealth of iron ore mines. So Lorenzo, having lost his brother, switched to his ward because their father, Pier Francesco de' Medici, had died and left Giovanni and Lorenzo as the wards of their uncle, Lorenzo the Magnificent. I wish they used different names. It gets very confusing. And she was related by marriage to King Ferrante of Naples, who had sided with Sixtus IV against the Medici. So imagine the challenge that Lorenzo the Magnificent faced as he sailed to Naples, bringing with him lavish gifts and money, and managed to negotiate not only peace with Ferrante, but also a marriage. It took him 3 years. So this is a major, major marriage alliance. Thus, you would commission your favorite artist, Botticelli, to paint not 2, but now 3 extraordinary images to hang in the bridal chamber. These are all painted on wood. Now you understand why when I saw a Virgin and Child on canvas, my little brain starts ticking, because I knew about these related to the Medici wedding, and I thought, there must be something to the use of why Botticelli would have painted on canvas. So if we just go through this, okay, we see, I'm going to decipher the figures. You see West Wind Zephyrus swooping in. He's grabbing a lusciously sexy, beautiful nymph who is Chloris. And when he marries her, and he does rape her and marry her, she turns into the happy, married, fertile Flora. So the 3 figures on the right visualize the rape, marriage, and transformation from sexy Chloris to fertile Flora. And of course, Zephyrus is swooping in. He bends the laurel trees, which are symbolic of Lorenzo di Pier Francesco, Lorenzo and Laurel. Then we move one to the left, and we see Venus dressed as a contemporary Florentine bride. She is under the arch. The blindfolded Cupid hovers above her. The plant behind her is myrtle, a symbol of marriage and fidelity. And of course, she's in this luscious grove of oranges, which are both in fruit and in blossom. And legend had it that as long as the orange trees in the Medici garden were flourishing, Florence would flourish. So we're already seeing connections with the bending laurel trees and the orange grove, references to the Medici. Then we get the 3 graces dancing with their hands entwined, symbolic of harmony. Typically, the 3 graces would accompany the bride in marriage ceremonies. And finally, at the far left, we see Mercury. And Mercury is doing something a little odd. He's stirring the clouds to make sure that the weather is perfect for this all-important wedding. And what's interesting is he stands with his back to the graces and Venus and the scene of Chloris becoming Flora. And I think he there is a reference to Lorenzo the Magnificent, who spent 3 years negotiating the marriage. So on your outline, you have all the texts. And so I'm not going to read them all to you because we're going to run out of time and I won't get to all the luscious images I have coming next. But what I love is everything is found in different literary sources. So Boccaccio describes the wealth of the flowers on grass that is so dark it looks almost black. One art historian spent, I think, her whole career identifying these flowers. They are so carefully depicted that they are botanically correct, and they are found blooming in the fields surrounding Florence in May. The wedding was originally planned for May, but Lorenzo the Magnificent's mother died, and it was then put off until July. And then we have Lucretius, who describes the figures: Venus, Cupid, Zephyr, Flora. And here the fertility of Flora is made absolutely clear by her lap being filled with roses that she tosses before her. And here is the whole story of Flora, of Chloris becoming Flora. He made amends for his violence by giving me the name of bride, and in my marriage bed I have naught to complain of. I enjoy perpetual spring, from Ovid. And we discussed that Venus is dressed like a Renaissance bride before the myrtle bush, which was sacred to Venus. And what I didn't know, I learned from Boccaccio. It was believed that from the berries of the myrtle bush, a certain substance can be made to excite passion and strengthen it. And according to a 16th century author, Mattioni, following the 1st century Dioscurides, myrtle wine would encourage moistness in the uterus and cure heavy menstrual cycles. Who knew? And from Altier in 1503, from myrtle, inimical to every violence, accompanied by flowers, fragrances, and other stimulants, come good auspices in the couple's future, including joy, desire, and the ability to copulate for the acquisition of healthy and amiable children. Here we have Venus with her red mantle and passion in the flames on her decoration. I think the moon is in her brooch or in her pendant. And all of this relates to the Medici, to their association with Eastern trade from the Council of Florence, and her clothing absolutely is there to allure her husband. The Graces, at the marriage of Isabella of Aragon and John Galeazzo Sforza, the 3 Graces were among the characters who entertained the wedding guests. So all of this is part of Renaissance marriage. Mercury looks like Donatello's David, which stood in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, commissioned by Cosimo the Elder. Mercury was the son of the god Maya. Remember, the wedding was originally scheduled for May, and was the god of eloquence, commerce, and peace. So again, absolutely associating all this imagery with the Medici family. And I keep wanting to believe that Mercury is an idealized portrait of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Others say it's the portrait of Lorenzo di Pier Francesco, but I believe he's being symbolized by Zephyrus. And that's this Botticelli portrait of an unknown gentleman holding the coin of Cosimo. I just wonder, are these idealized images of Lorenzo the Magnificent? So here we have this coupled with this image of Camilla and the centaur, which if you just stop for 1 minute, it's very clear. Camilla controls the lustful centaur. Centaurs were the symbols of unbridled lust, and she's grabbed him by the hair. He's been completely empowered, and there she stands in clothing with myrtle all over her, and 3 entwined diamond rings, which are the symbol of the Medici, as I show you here. So it is the wisdom and strength of the woman to control the male passions. And if you note, in the background is a quiet harbor. So if the woman is in control of the male passions, you will have a safe harbor. And of course, there's something about Camilla that reminds us of Donatello's Judith and Holofernes, which was also commissioned by the Medici and stood in the Medici garden surrounded by the orange trees. So we understand that first we have a rape and fertility, and then we have control of passions. And ultimately, you've got to bring in religion, and the virgin has to be there as a model for the bride. And so here is Botticelli's incredibly beautiful Madonna of the Magnificat, where Christ is guiding the hand of the Virgin as she writes the Magnificat. So there they are, all together, and conforming to Alberti's advice. Whenever man and wife come together, it is advisable only to hang portraits of persons of dignity and handsome appearance, for they say that this may have a great influence on the fertility of the mother and the appearance of future offspring. Okay, before we go to this Botticelli, I think we should take like a 4-minute break, and I'll answer questions in the meantime. Sorry for speaking so quickly. It's my curse. Okay, now I have to stop sharing because I see that there are chats, and let me see the chat. Oh, got it, came. Okay, there we go. Oh my God, did the Queen of Sheba have red hair? Who knows? That's up to the artist's imagination. I would say probably not. But, you know, the Madonna probably didn't have blonde hair. So it's called Imagination and Ideals. I will say that the concept of forced remarriage has no bearing in the Renaissance because women had no voice. Well, some women had voices. I mean, Moderata Fonte certainly had a voice. I think we believe women had no voices, but the recent scholarship, I would say in the last 20 years, has uncovered a lot of female voices, which is making this whole subject really exciting. Regina Bry on the slide, which queen would this have virgin? Possibly Esther, but I'm not sure. I noticed that it said Queen Ebraya, so that would be Hebrew queen. So I don't know. I think it's bringing, that was for the Sforza. So bringing, you know, the Old Testament and all the world to celebrate the marriage. The upper torso of the Venus, who is supine, looks peculiarly built like a male. Oh, you mean in the Cassone? Okay. Yes, very, what's the word? Dephysicalized? That sounds wrong. Made, I think often the physicality of the female was under exaggerated. So I agree with you. Or one could say the male with the flowers covering his genitalia could have been mistaken for a woman. So kind of neutering in a way, odd. It's clear that even in the most dynastic arranged marriages, sexual and emotional compatibility and happiness for both spouses was to be desired. Do we have any contemporary women's writings with their own? No. Well, we know that Eleonora of Toledo was very happily married to Cosimo I. That is the first time I've read about a happy marriage. I'm sure there were happy marriages. It would have been so wretched to be a female. You would be constantly pregnant, postpartum, and pregnant again. I mean, and when we look at these women artists in our last two classes, can you imagine being constantly pregnant or postpartum, and you're painting and you're running a business and you're having 13 children? I don't know about you, but it's not that easy having a child. So it kind of amazes me And I'm not sure they had a whole lot of time to write, even though they were educated. So I am not a historian of Renaissance women. I'm getting intrigued and I've loved this whole process, but I can't answer your question. I'm sorry. Is the centaur painting entitled? Oh, it's either. Nobody really knows. Is she Minerva or Pallas? The consensus tends to be that she is Pallas. No, all of the Primavera ones are on wood. That's what triggered my brain. That Primavera, Pallas and the Centaur, and Madonna of the Magnificat are all on wood panel. Very heavy, impossible to transport, versus a canvas that can be rolled up. And what if I'm going to go back to the Minerva and the Centaur for a second, because of what I forgot to mention is often people don't realize that the cliff on the left is actually a natural stone cliff, but it looks extraordinarily architectural, which could be a way of Botticelli saying the wisdom of the female controlling the male passions cultivates nature. So I mean, everything in that painting, the harbor, the control of the centaur, and that architectural cliff are about controlling wild nature. Any other questions?
My question has to do with the dynastic power that a few women that you depicted in this first half of this session, when they had the opportunity, they were not only gentle, but they were also powerful.
Yes.
Which is a cultivation of the wisdom that you just mentioned, because women were very wise in terms of marriage success based on the culture that was there in the 15th, 16th centuries.
Some women might.
Except, but well, that's where I was going with it.
Okay.
Because there were exceptions. There were very few in number. The one that from last lecture, Gilandea, I think was her name, the artist. There was a woman artist you highlighted last week.
I did a women artist last week.
You mentioned one of her art canvases.
Artemisia. We have a whole lecture on her on the last lecture.
The last lecture. Okay, so that was my idea of how you're presenting this session, because it has the balance of power, dowry, cassone, all the attributes of what was procession, feast, even in the 21st century. I mean, if you see something in an image of a feast, it's like, wow.
That's why I started with images of 21st century marriages.
Well, you know, it's well, and that's life. You know, in the 21st century, it's kind of the circle of life when you look at history of art and history of people, humanity.
I don't think women have to marry someone they've never met today. So I think there has been some advances, and there is something known as birth control, which helps too. Okay, all right, let's go back, because as you can imagine, I have lots more to share. Okay, so wait a minute, I have to share the screen. Okay, all right, so look at this scene. Immediately, I want you to start assuming, oh, there's something over here. Oh, hold on. I have a big white box here. Hold on, I have to escape. What's this? No, this. How do I get rid of this box? I'll just pull it down there. Okay, now I'll share. Stop share. Okay, here we go. All right, so when you see a horizontal image like this and many others that I'm going to show you, I want you from now on to go marriage cassone. So whether or not this is much too big a work to have been on a chest, but it was probably set into a wall in the Lettuccio, which was the wooden bed and paneling that surrounded it. So imagine here you are in your marriage bed, and clearly what you're seeing is the woman in control again, Venus, who has completely disempowered Mars. It's post-coital. He's passed out. It takes place in either in a laurel or myrtle grove, the trees behind Venus. A little baby satyr blows a conch shell in Mars' ears, trying to wake him up. And some say, you know, this is kind of an image with the wasps. If you look in the lower right, the tree branch that has been severed is the home of a wasp nest. You see the wasp buzzing around there. Neither the wasps nor the blowing of the conch shell seem to awaken Mars. Does this mean that love is accompanied by pain? Or more, maybe, more likely, this has to have been connected to a Vespucci marriage. We have not been able to identify which marriage. Everybody wants to identify Venus as Simonetta di Vespucci, but she was already dead. So this is not Simonetta's marriage, but the wasp in Vespa in Italian means wasp. So this has to have been related to a Vespucci marriage, because where those wasps are swarming is also the traditional location for a coat of arms. So, and it would be totally understandable that the Vespucci would hire Botticelli, because Vespucci, Medici, and Tornabuoni were all part of the same social circle. So here I show you the Ghirlandaio birth of the Virgin, where you see how a bedroom might have been decorated. So you can imagine where this image of Venus and Mars might have hung, or the way the National Gallery depicts it is framed above a cassone. And Venus is clothed, and Mars is passed out, outstanding in strength among the planets because he makes men stronger. But Venus masters him. She seems to master Mars, but Mars never masters Venus. Written by Marsilio Ficino, who was living in the Medici Palace, who was given a house on the Medici Villa of Castello. And so you know what is being discussed. And you see Mars is being disarmed by love. And then we have another description of a lost painting. And many of these Renaissance artists were inspired by descriptions of lost classical paintings. This one by Etienne of the wedding ceremony of Alexander and Roxanne. Hold on to it, because we're going to see another image of Alexander and Roxanne, where Lucian mentions Pucci playing with Alexander's armor, specifically with his lance, as you see here, the little satyrs, and his breastplate. So you have another little horned satyr climbing into Mars's breastplate. And Lucretius tells us, though Mars the warlord rules war's savage works, yet often he throws himself into your arms, faint with love's deathless wound, and there with arching neck bent back, looks up and sighs, and feeds a lustful eye on you, and pillowed, dangles his life's breath from your lips. Then, as he falls back on your sacred body, lady, lean over and let sweet utterance pour from your holy lips, a plea of peace for Rome. So I'm just giving you all these literary associations that do not control Botticelli. Botticelli absorbs them and creates these extraordinary images. Just to give you a sense of how extraordinary, I show you a Cassone painting by an anonymous Florentine of a similar subject. Mars isn't there, but there's Venus reclining on a pillow with Cupids or winged or not winged Pucci playing with her. And you can see that Botticelli puts us in an entirely different realm. but the typical nature of these images and associations with marriage is clear. And since we like to look at kind of erotic drapery, look at the drapery that Venus is holding, evocative of the female private parts, sensual, and also emphasizing her womb as well, with these gathering of lusciously painted drapery. Or this is a mirror frame that was designed after Antonio Pollaiuolo, and we assume it was related to the Medici because of the diamond ring, which was an insignia used by Piero de' Medici, father of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and later family members. And here we also see a similar depiction of Venus without her clothes here, and the exhausted Mars. There's also another classical myth of Endymion, who traded his eternal youth, but was condemned to sleep forever. So in this mirror, an emphasis on beauty, of love, and of course, fertility. Now you can imagine Savonarola didn't like this very much, and he condemned Florentines for having near their beds and lettucci images of naked men and women doing indecent things. So we have to remember that with the sermons of Savonarola, we have to remember that erotic art did indeed flourish in the Renaissance, and that until later in the 16th century, the church and state condemned every kind of sex outside of wedlock. But certainly we saw with the poor Catherine and Marie de' Medici, their husbands did not control themselves. And I'm sure even when we looked in the beginning with the Sforza, the heir to the Sforza dukeship was the illegitimate child because the marriage didn't produce children. So clearly men were playing around, women were locked up, and Savonarola wanted, no erotic images should be allowed. So I'm showing you here, there are many, many, many marriage casones in museums all over Europe and America, but this is the only one. It is a pair that are intact with their panel above, so which are called spallieri, backboards. And this was commissioned for the Morelli-Nerli marriage of Lorenzo Morelli, a Florentine merchant, to Viaggia Nerli, a Florentine aristocrat. He was marrying up. He must have allowed her dowry to be minimal. And both coats of arms are shown on the chest. So that's how we know to which marriage this survives. And Lorenzo Morelli recorded his marital expenses. And in that list was 2 cassoni ordered in 1472. So again, these are stories inviting the viewers, the married couple, into new worlds, decorated with scenes from Roman history and virtues. So here we see the virtues, prudence and temperance. A more interesting one, and there are many, many of these cassone which have very violent scenes, not unlike the ones I'm about to show you. And here's why violent stories were part of the marriage furniture. And you just have to imagine that they were a way of, as we saw with the one from Boccaccio for Cosimo de' Medici, they were somewhat justifying the violent nature of Renaissance marriage. So this is Botticelli's panels that depict the story of Nastaggio degli Onesti from Boccaccio's Decameron. It is a rather unpleasant story, I warn you. He painted 4 Spallieri panels for Antonio Pucci, the father of Giannozzo, because this is celebrating the marriage of Giannozzo Pucci to Lucrezia Bini. And again, notice how many women in the Renaissance are called Lucrezia. We discussed the kind of the oddity of that, why her killing herself was considered such a virtuous act. Giannozzo had just lost his first wife, Esmeralda degli Ugolino, in 1482, and then made a quick second marriage in 1483 to Lucrezia Bini. And Lorenzo the Magnificent was the marriage broker. He arranged this marriage because the Pucci were close allies of the Medici. And then Giannozzo died, 14 years later, defending the Medici. So let's see what Botticelli has depicted. And I have to tell you the story. One day, while wandering in a pine forest, Nastasio sees a naked girl in tears, running, chased by two dogs and a knight, Guido of Anastagi, who was also rejected by the young woman. He committed suicide. When the girl died without remorse, she was condemned to being hunted and killed endlessly. So in a way, Guido of Anastagi was almost like a Lucrezia. And this story relates to rejection by the woman and the man being distraught. So here we see the woman being chased by the hunter and caught and killed. I think her innards are removed and tossed to the hounds in the lower right. And this goes on and on and on. But then Nastasio plans a banquet at the same spot in the pine forest that he saw this woman being killed by the hunter. And he expects the horrifying scene to repeat, with the hunter explaining why. And Nastasio's beloved then understands that she should not reject him and that she should agree to marry him. So here you have the hunter chasing the female and Nastasio telling the guests at the banquet what is going on, and his beloved agreeing to marry him, not rejecting him anymore. And what we also see is images of contemporary coats of arms. In the center, you see the Medici coat of arms. Of course, Lorenzo negotiated this marriage. And I think Antonio Pucci is the guy in black. And finally, this is all celebrated at a wedding banquet, a triumphal wedding banquet, since it's taking place in a loggia that resembles a triumphant arch. And the moral of the story for the bride in her marital chamber: ladies, be kinder to your gentlemen, and to the gentlemen, don't you be spendthrift, waste your money. So you cannot be arrogant or nasty in order to have a successful, fertile marriage. Now, Leon Battista Alberti, in the 15th century, wrote something called Intercenales, which translates to be dinner pieces, to be read during dinner. This is the secular version of a convent or a monastic meal where the nuns or monks would be read from the New Testament. This would be read to amuse the guests, and I'm just giving you some fun quotations. Woman is a fickle creature and given to pleasure. Every woman is wanton, inconstant, troublesome, proud, querulous, shameless, and stubborn. And then in his De la Familia, marriage was instituted by nature, our most excellent and divine teacher of all things, with the provision that there should be one constant life's companion for a man and one only. He's speaking out of both sides of his mouth for different readers and different contexts. They say that in choosing a wife, one looks for beauty, parentage, and riches. Even a wild, prodigal, greasy, drunken woman may be beautiful of feature, but no one would call her a beautiful wife. In her body, he must seek not only loveliness, grace, and charm, but must also choose a woman who is well made for bearing children, the kind of constitution that promises to make them strong and big. Okay, now we leave Florence behind, we leave the 15th century, and we enter the 16th century in Rome. We've visited here last year, I think. This is Agostino Chigi's villa on the banks of the Tiber, now called the Villa Farnesina, but originally the Villa Chigi. which was built for love and entertainment, remembering that Kiji had been rejected by, I think, a Mantuan aristocrat, and went on papal business to Venice and fell in love with a baker's daughter. I think it was a baker's daughter, fell in love with her, brought her with him back to Rome. They had, I think, 4 or 5 children before he got around to marrying her. And at his marriage, Leo X officiated and celebrated at a lavish feast. So this, and if we look at this facade of the Villa Farnesina, this could be transformed into a temporary theater for classical drama, contemporary theatrical productions. And Kiji was extremely well versed in classical literature, because in the basement of his villa, he had a printing office, which specialized in printing Greek and Roman texts. So that's giving you the background. And if you enter through that arcade, you are surrounded by the marriage of Cupid and Psyche in this false tapestry hanging above you as if you are still outside. So if you go here, there is this wonderful interplay between exterior and interior. So you enter the arcade and you are engulfed in mythological figures, the story of Cupid and Psyche, which culminates in the Feast of the Gods and their marriage. This was painted primarily by Raphael's studio. And on August 28, 1519, Agostino celebrated his marriage to his beloved Francesca. So only a part of this was finished. Originally, the lower walls were also to be painted as well, and the exterior walls of the arcade were to be decorated as well. And it is the story of Cupid and Psyche is loosely based on Apuleius's Golden Ass from the 2nd century. And what was completed was the ceiling and the spandrels, which relate the story of Psyche, a beautiful maiden, more beautiful than Venus. And of course, that absolutely infuriates Venus. How could someone be more beautiful than she? So she sends Cupid to punish Psyche. Big mistake, since Cupid falls in love with Psyche. Then Venus forbids Cupid to see her. She imprisons him. And finally, with his begging and the begging of the Graces, Venus relents, but gives Psyche 4 impossible tasks. We're not going to look at the whole scene of Cupid and Psyche, but it is a celebration of love, perhaps a platonic ascent of the soul through love, but it is Kiji justifying his love for Francesca and his dallying or avoiding marriage and finally celebrating his marriage to his beloved. And showing you some of the classical sources for these images. There you see the marriage of Cupid and Psyche, and I show you the bed of Polyclitus, which was well known in Rome at the time, and that turned female, and a sarcophagus representing the marriage of Cupid and Psyche as well. And just to recall the phallic nature of many of these images, here is Mercury showing his stuff, swooping in. But my favorite detail is the phallic zucchini above to the right, which is aiming towards the breaking of the melon. So fertility visualized. And what I didn't know, that in Italian, uccello, and you see all these birds flying around all these fruits and vegetables, uccello is slang for the penis. That was news to me. And a quote from Paolo Giovio: There entered there one morning a lady who, wishing to appear a person of culture and intelligence, admired and praised the paintings very much. And she said, certainly all these figures are most excellent, but I could have wished, Signor Raphael, for the sake of your reputation, that you had painted a nice rose or a fig leaf over the shame of Mercury. Then said Raphael, smiling, pardon me, Madonna, but I did not think of this. And then he added, but why did you not suggest that I should do the same thing for Polyphemus, whom you praise so much and whose shame is so much larger? And somehow she missed the zucchini. Now we go upstairs to Kiji's bedroom. I show it on the plan. And there we see an image by Il Sodima of Alexander and Roxanne. What's interesting to me is that his bedroom was adjacent to the banqueting hall. So what did he do? Sneak off and have sex in the middle of dinner? Who knows? And this painting by Sodima evokes the same ekphrasis of the painting by Etienne, which we looked at in the Botticelli Mars and Venus, which was described by Lucian and Herodotus. So let's get closer. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but basically this description from Lucian describes exactly what you see. A very beautiful chamber, a bridal couch with Roxanne sitting upon it, her eyes cast down, smiling cupids, one removing her veil, the other one showing Roxanne to her future husband, one taking off her sandal, a third holding Alexander's cloak and pulling him towards her. And he holds out a garland to the maiden, and his best man, Hephaestion, is there with a blazing torch, leaning on a handsome youth. And then cupids are playing with Alexander's armor, convincing him that love is more important than war. The same theme that we saw with Mars and Venus. So here we have a very different style, far more sensual. There is the luscious Roxanne being disrobed by Cupid in preparation for the marital night. And Alexander holds out a garland toward her. His lover Hephaestion, I guess Alexander went both ways. His lover Hephaestion is standing there beautifully posed in contrapposto with drapery hiding his private parts in this glorious bedchamber with the county bed, cupids everywhere, a landscape behind, cupids taming Alexander's horse, exotic handmaidens from exotic parts of the world, one particularly of color, and there's a scholar or several scholars are working specifically on the representation of figures of color in Renaissance paintings. And what I think is most extraordinary in a way is that you have a balustrade in the foreground and we are welcomed in. So it's almost as if this very scene of Alexander's marriage night is taking place with us in the room with them. And that wonderful perspectival vista behind draws us in so that we are part of this erotic scene. It seems that Il Sodima may have based his composition on a drawing by Raphael. Raphael was very busy at this time. Kiji complained about Raphael not having enough time to work for him entirely. In fact, it's even said that Kiji allowed Raphael to bring his loved one with him so he wouldn't be running off to have a love affair rather than painting. And you look at, we wish in a way that Raphael had painted this because I think there's much more life in the Raphael drawing than in the Sodima painting. And of course, Raphael's number one pupil and head of his workshop was Giulio Romano. And Giulio Romano painted this painting of two lovers around 1525 without that classical text. And here it's pure eroticism, really, an image of kind of unbridled lust, with all sorts of anecdotes and allusions. Another one, if you look at the old lady coming in to spy or disturb these figures, either before or after their relations, she has, the dog is jumping on her saying, no, 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 don't bother them, and sniffing at a bunch of keys. And keys were, just like bird was a slang for penis, keys were slang for intercourse, to turn a key in a lock. So you have the keys on the lady, you have the female kind of delicately removing the drapery covering the male's private parts. And this seems to have been painted by Giulio Romano when he arrived in Mantua, right around the sack of Rome, before the sack of Rome. And Vasari mentions a painting of a similar subject given to Vespasiano I Gonzaga by his cousin Federico Gonzaga. And art historians have wanted to give this a subject. They've called it From Boccaccio, they've called it Mars and Venus, but there's no armor. They've called it Alexander and Roxanne. There's nothing identifying it as Alexander and Roxanne. They've called it Zeus and Alcmene, or the unfaithful wife, or a courtesan and a client, struggling to give it a specific topic rather than kind of allowing it to be an erotic image. And certainly, as we saw when we looked at the Villa Palazzo del Te in Mantua, which was Federico's kind of love nest for him and his mistress, Isabella Boschetti. This kind of imagery flourished in Mantua in the Gonzaga court. So I'm not going to read all these literary sources, but you can have a classical source, Theocritus, which talks about Adonis and his bride, or you can have Cardinal Bibbieno, who was in residence in the Vatican, who wrote a very racy play called La Calandria, based on a Roman story that he wrote for Isabella d'Este. And then it was performed in Mantua as well. So it's possible this image might have been painted for Federico's marriage to Margherita Paleogola, and we looked at those portraits, one portrait by Giulio Romano. And again, an arranged marriage. There was Federico having his dalliance with his beloved Isabella Boschetti. And I just show you a classical Roman sarcophagus, which was the source for some of the figures in Giulio Romano's painting. Or there's a whole tradition in the North, very different in style, of scenes of lovers on the bed. So Giulio Romano may have been familiar with this kind of northern, more humorous erotic prints that would have traveled to Italy. Totally different, but bringing in some of the elements that Giulio Romano brings, like the shoes, the cat hovering under the bed, the dog, the canopied bed. And of course, these reclining female nudes became incredibly beautiful and popular with Titian, who may also have been familiar with Northern kind of satirical wood prints. And I just show you three of Titian's Venuses, with the organist, which was painted for Philip II and now is in the Prado, and all these other versions, because obviously they became incredibly popular. I don't think they represent courtesans. I really believe that they are all marriage images. Or this print, woodcut or etching after Parmigianino of Venus and Mars embracing while Vulcan works at the forge. Of course, Venus was married to Vulcan while she was carrying on with Mars. So all these kinds of images form the context, the background for these beautiful Renaissance erotic images. And here I remind you of Giulio Romano's Banquet of the Gods in the Palazzo del Te. You don't get any more sensual or blatantly erotic than Giulio Romano's imagery for Federico in his Palazzo del Te. So let's move to Venice, because I can't do all of Venice in one lecture next week. Let's look at these horizontal images of female nudes. The earliest one in Venice is Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, which is in Dresden from about 1510. It was in the collection by 1525 of Girolamo Marcello, who married Morosina Pisani in 1507. And we assume that this image is related to that marriage and was hanging in that bedchamber. Marcello had extremely good taste. He owned 3 Giorgiones, including the odd one on the right, which perhaps might have been an image of Mars. It's called Soldier with his Manservant. So if he had in the bedchamber an image of Mars and a sleeping Venus, we are beginning to understand that this is the kind of images that were associated with marriage. And the Marcello family claimed Venus, probably astrologically, as their tutelary goddess. So what about this image? It's the first reclining nude, other than those Cassone ones, which were probably not known in Venice, or maybe there were similar ones that haven't been preserved from Venice. And we know that Titian, as Giorgione, working with Giorgione, altered the landscape, as he did in the Feast of Gods in Ferrara, and that originally we know from X-rays that a Cupid sat at her feet. And the way he altered the landscape was to make the landscape more harmonious with the curves of her body. And we know that these kinds of images were associated with marriages and in bedrooms, because in 1532, Marcantonio Michiel, who visited Venice and visited all the key houses and described their collections, he described a now lost reclining nude by Savoldo, which hung over the bed of Andrea Odeon. So we can then extrapolate from this that this is the kind of image that was desirable for bedroom imagery. Now, I mentioned this before, but I want to document it for you. This is from Giovanni di Michele Savonarola, who was a physician, humanist, and scholar. A woman cannot get pregnant without feeling great pleasure in the sexual act, as she then emits her seed and the womb is constricted, as it is written. Before they begin to copulate, they must talk together about conceiving and image the conception. After talking like this, they must touch each other, and especially the man must touch the woman, touching and rubbing with his fingers the place between her sex and the vagina. As soon as the man has poured his seed, his wife must immediately lift her thighs, he must get up, and at once she must hold her thighs, legs, and feet together and keep them lifted for 1/6 of an hour, so that the sperm can more easily enter the womb and be retained there. And also because the air must not penetrate and spoil the seed. So now that we're looking at this image of this beautiful sleeping brunette, unusual to have a brunette, but I remind you of Giorgione's Laura. Maybe he liked brunettes more. We see that what we are witnessing, and she's not looking at us, so it's very easy to imagine that this is a comfortable image to be viewed, that she is ensuring her ability to conceive. And Claudianus's Epithalamium of Palladius and Celerina, I chanced that Venus had one day retired into the bosom of a cave overgrown with vine to woo sleep mid its alluring cool, and had laid her goddess limbs on the thick grass, her head upon a heap of flowers. The vine branches stir gently in the breeze and sway the full-veined grapes. Slumber befits the disorder of her brow. The midday heat will numb the coverings, and the leaves show through them the gleam of her bare breast. So a description of the sleeping Venus. Okay, so Titian worked on this image and then was hired to paint his own marriage imagery. His most beautiful and probably most famous one is his Sacred and Profane Love, which is in the Borghese Gallery from 1514. Now, the first question I usually ask is, okay, which is sacred and which is profane? And most people will say sacred is clothed and profane is nude. But the traditional analysis puts sacred as nude, ideal, and profane as garbed like a bride. But I'm going to show you it's more complicated than that. But let's first understand the commission of this beautiful horizontal painting of two beautiful blonde women. It was commissioned by the Venetian cittadino, Niccolo Aurelio, who was secretary to the Council of Ten. So just to remind you, in Venice, patricians only had government positions, were members of the Great Council. But cittadini, citizens of Venice, could hold extremely important non-governmental roles. So as secretary, he had an extremely important role as secretary to the Council of Ten, which was really like the CIA of Venetian government. And he commissioned Titian to paint this on the occasion of his marriage to Laura Bagherotto. Now, this was not Laura's first marriage. Her first marriage was to a Paduan nobleman, Francesco Borromeo, who was executed for treason because he had supported the imperial forces in 1509 at the League of Cambrai. And he was then declared a traitor to the Venetian Republic. So, wow. Niccolo Aurelio was making a rather risky marriage, given that he was working for the Venetian government. Her father and uncle were also condemned and hung in the piazzetta just outside of the Doge's palace. But Niccolo petitioned Doge Loredan and the Council of Ten, and they approved her marriage to Niccolo Aurelio in 1514. They were married on May 17th. Laura Bagherotto's dowry was returned to her in 1514 and probably paid for the painting. And her dowry included a white satin dress, 25 pearls, and property, and a villa near Cittadella. So it's been actually suggested was Laura the patron of this painting, but I think more likely Niccolo Aurelio, who would have been familiar with Titian through his association with the Council of Ten. And I circle, was this painting identified with Niccolo Aurelio? That is his coat of arms on the sarcophagus. So, which is lovelier, adorned or unadorned? Which was an endless debate in 16th century literature. Is this a portrait? Probably not. These are idealized images of women. I would doubt Laura Bagherotto looked like this. And of course, Michelangelo said, who cares about portraiture? No one's going to know 100 years from now what the Medici dukes in the Medici chapel looked like. So it doesn't matter if the figure looks like anyone. So this is a kind of visual marriage poem, epithalamium, where every detail speaks of marital bliss and idyllic love. We have the jeweled belt around the clothed Laura, the silver bowl, a wedding present, the sculpted fountain, the golden hair, the marriage colors of red and white, roses of love, rabbits of fertility. Who are these ladies? The traditional interpretation is that earthly love is dressed like a bride on the left, and celestial love is pure and devoid of physicality, an ideal nude. But the situation gets complicated if we turn to Boccaccio, who describes both Venuses, earthly, the mother of Cupid, goddess of sex, nude, holds a torch, all-consuming heat of sexual passion. So for Boccaccio, earthly Venus is nude, and celestial Venus rules over spring and wears a girdle, a belt, and is accompanied by swans and dove and is the goddess of marriage. And I show you an image, a fresco from the Palazzo Schifanoia of the Triumph of Venus, which is the celestial Venus, which looks like the Titian's Venus on the left. I'm not going to be able to resolve this for you because I just discovered this Boccaccio association, and it upsets the apple cart for me because I have always understood the Titian's dressed Venus as the bride and the ideal celestial Venus as the classical nude. But I show you the Cosa image of April and the triumph of celestial Venus, which is dressed very much like Titian's. So Titian's bride, or clothed Venus, wears the traditional bridal clothing, the belt, the gloves on her hand, the wreath around her hair. Her hair is down, as is appropriate for a bride, and once she's married, her hair goes up, and she must be pure and sexual. So she is, it's the Mary Eve contradiction. And here she looks out as if accepting her duty as bride. My honest young woman does not seek to look about, nor even to be looked at by anyone, and she does not turn her eyes here or there. So Titian is showing us a bold depiction of this woman. And I remind you of Donna Volata by Raphael, and we looked at that sleeve drapery, and notice how Titian has placed his figure. Her legs are apart. And so we wonder, is he making her for potential fertility visible? And of course, you see the two bunnies in the background. So if we look again, we're looking at these two women. I still tend to believe that the bride is crowned with myrtle holding roses, and that the chaste aspect of the virtuous bride is represented by the nude with the church spire behind her. The church steeple, I think, appropriately is on the celestial Venus side, and we see the hair being chaste, kind of like the pursuit of love and marriage, and the much more earthly side with the rabbits and the fortified city. And of course, Laura Bagarotto was not a virgin when she married. So one scholar has proposed that this visualizes the double aspect of Renaissance marriage, both the consummation and the sacrament. So you have the consent visualized by the woman looking out, and the publicity, meaning the announcement of the marriage and the consummation. And then you have the contradictory spiritual and erotic nature of sacred on the right. And finally, you have the coat of arms beside the phallic water spout. And it has been said, but not confirmed because of cleaning, later restoration, that the Bagarotto coat of arms is in that silver bowl in the center. I can't confirm or negate that, but notice that Cupid is stirring the waters. Remember Botticelli's Venus and the necessity of churning the waters that pour out to water and fertilize the rose plant of Venus. And here is another image of the celestial Venus, celestial love here partially clothed and holding a flame. So another justification for seeing Titian's nude as celestial love. And then if we look at that relief, it's complicated. It's classical in style. We don't know the subject. We don't have a source. But if we dissect it a bit, on the left, on the far left is a Herm, which is a Priapus Herm, son of Bacchus and Venus, the god of fertility. and an unbridled horse, which is symbolic of unbridled passions. And a horse is another euphemism for the phallus. And that goes leaning towards the water spout. And on the right, a man is flogging, it seems to be another man, while a woman stands in shock behind. And a man far in the shadows on the far right rushes forward, perhaps to stop the brutality or save the woman standing there as witness, somewhat like St. George rescuing the princess, or possibly a reference to the story of Adonis, who was punished by Mars for loving Venus. So I think what Titian has done is just combine many references to, in this relief, reveal kind of the aspects of marriage, that sexual desire must be restrained and harnessed, just like Botticelli's Minerva or Pallas and the Centaur. So we have this extraordinarily beautiful image, this incredibly complex commentary on Renaissance marriage, of the dichotomy between chastity and virtue and sensuality and sexuality. Okay, you know what? I'm going to stick this in our Venice lecture. I'll figure out how to do it, because I had a really exciting, I think, discovery. I'm going to share it very briefly with you so you can ponder, and we'll come back to it next week. But I just want to show you. Hold on. Okay, look at these two ladies. One is a double marriage portrait and one is a Venus. And I am convinced that these are the same woman. This is not an idealized image of a beautiful Venus. She's got a very distinguished or identifiable face, which seems very much like this other one. But we will come back to that next week, when we also enjoy Titian's Venus of Urbino. So once again, I didn't really finish, but I promise I will come back, because these are some of my favorite images. So let me do that, do that. The Giorgione bears a striking resemblance to the Manet. You mean the Venus? I think Manet might have been more influenced by the Titian, but Manet definitely knew Giorgione and Titian for sure. But we're not going to discuss that, because that'll get me on a whole nother tangent. The Republican legislator who argued that a woman who is raped cannot get pregnant must have been familiar. I love it. Yes. I love it. Thank you for that. Okay. You can tell this is such an incredibly rich subject. I think we could possibly do a whole class on Renaissance marriage. Not ready for that yet. But I am just fascinated by all these images that Western art historians, I'm going to mostly British and American art historians of the 20th century, were convinced were courtesans and now seem to be related to Renaissance marriage. So that's something that I still need to dig around in, but the imagery is extraordinary. So we'll see more next week when we spend only a day in Venice. Thanks so much. Bye.